The next chapter discusses one of the foundational models in economics, the model of demand and supply.
In this video, we'll discuss some of the important assumptions underlying the demand and supply model, and we'll also start talking about some important vocabulary terms related to demand.
Remember, economic models are simplified representations of the real world that help us examine variables of interest. Our model of demand and supply is going to allow us to look at how prices and quantities of goods and services are determined. But first, we're going to have to make some simplifying assumptions. First, we're going to assume that there are many buyers and many sellers. So no single buyer or seller is going to be able to have any influence on the price of a good or service. Additionally, we're going to assume that all products that are being sold are identical. So that means that individuals don't have any preferences over which seller they buy from. Additionally, there are no barriers to entry. This means that any firm that is willing and able to sell the product can, and any buyer that's willing and able to buy the product also can. Finally, we have rational agents. So we have individuals who are trying to maximize their utility and firms that are trying to maximize their profits. And in every market, we have two sides. Buyers make up the demand side of the market, and sellers make up the supply side of the market. We can also call buyers consumers and sellers firms. So buyers and consumers and sellers and firms will be used interchangeably. So first we're going to start with the demand side of the market. And here we have what's called a demand schedule. A demand schedule shows the quantity of a good or service demanded at each price per unit of that good or service. So in this case, we have the quantity of dumplings demanded in millions at each price of dumplings from 50 cents to $3 per dumpling. So if the price of each dumpling was $3, then 3 million dumplings would be demanded. If the price were to fall to $2.50, then 3.2 million dumplings would be demanded. And we can take this demand schedule and use it to create a demand curve. And a demand curve is a curve that graphically represents the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So to draw a demand curve, we first need to create our axes. Got our horizontal axis, which we are going to label quantity, and this is going to be quantity of dumplings in millions. And price always goes on the vertical axis. And to graph our demand curve, we can just plot the points from the demand schedule. So at a price of $3, 3 million dumplings are demanded. So we have the first point on our demand curve. If the price were to fall to $2.50, quantity demanded would rise to 3.2 million. So we have the second point on our demand curve. If the price were to fall to $1.25 per dumpling, the quantity demanded would rise to 3.6 million. If the price of dumplings were to fall to $1, the quantity demanded would rise to 4.1 million. And if the price were to fall to 50 cents per dumpling, the quantity demanded would rise to 5.7 million. And once we have all these points plotted, we can connect these points to create our demand curve for dumplings. So a quick vocabulary note that I want to make. There is a difference between quantity demanded and demand. Quantity demanded is the amount of a good or service that customers are willing and able to buy at a particular price. So the quantity demanded of dumplings is represented in one column of our demand schedule. And as the price changes, the price of dumplings changes, the quantity demanded of dumplings changes. Demand, on the other hand, refers to the entire relationship between price and quantity demanded. So refers to the entire relationship represented in our demand schedule and by our demand curve. The law of demand says that ceteris paribus, or holding everything else constant, as price increases, quantity demanded decreases. This means that there is a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, or our demand curve slopes downwards. This downward relationship is due to both a substitution effect and an income effect that come into play as prices change. The substitution effect is the idea that as prices change, we're going to switch to goods that are relatively cheaper. So as the price of a particular good or service rises, we'll switch to alternatives that are now relatively cheaper. The income effect says that as prices of goods change, our purchasing power changes, and that's going to affect how much we're able to purchase. For instance, if the price of a good or service rises, we can now afford less with the same income that we had before. So for instance, if bread costs $2 and I have $10, well, at the price of $2, I can afford 5 loaves of bread. But if that price of bread rose to $5 a loaf, I would now only be able to afford 2 loaves of bread. So if the price of a good changes, then quantity demanded changes, or we move along the demand curve. So if, for instance, the price changed from P0 to P1, that's going to change the quantity demanded from Q0 to Q1, which is just a movement along this demand curve from point A to point B. And so here we can see that quantity demanded is responding to these changes in the price. So the price is our independent variable, and quantity demanded is our dependent variable. However, we graph our independent variable on the vertical axis and our dependent variable on the horizontal axis. And this is kind of contrary to what you've been taught in many other subjects. But this is the way economists do it. This is how we've always done it. And we will not accept graphs with price on the horizontal axis and quantity on the vertical axis. So So now that we know that changes in a product's own price are going to move us along a demand curve, now we want to think about things that might change the demand curve, might change how much people are willing and able to buy at every price. A demand increase means that at any price, people are willing and able to purchase more of a good or service, which we can represent as a shift in the demand curve to the right. So the shift from D0 to D1 is an increase in demand. A decrease in demand means that at any price, people are willing and able to purchase less of a good or service. So this means that the demand curve shifts to the left. So the movement from D sub 0 to D2 is a decrease in demand. So now that we know how to represent an increase and a decrease in demand, let's think about the factors that might cause an increase or decrease in demand.